Zoom room. We'll get started in just a moment. Hello and welcome to WITA, and thank you for joining us for today's emergency webinar on the Supreme Court's IEPA ruling. We have really grateful to our speakers. I sent them an email at within about an hour of the ruling, and they were the first six and the best six that we could have hoped for this quick discussion today. Kathleen Claussen is professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. Wendy Cutler is a senior vice president at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Joe Damond is chair of international trade policy and global life sciences at Crowell Global Advisors. Peter Harrell is a visiting scholar at Georgetown's Institute for International Economic Law. Kay Kalukowicz is a senior managing director at McLarty Associates. And Chris Padilla is a senior advisor at Brunswick Group. Guys, big news today, and I want to start with Peter. If you could break down what we heard today and what's in the ruling that you've been able to discern in the few hours we've had since it was released.
Yeah, well, Ken, thanks for inviting me to join, and it's great to be on with such a distinguished group of co-panelists. So we got the decision we'd been waiting for the last month or two, or at least many of us have been waiting for, in the learning resources case challenging Trump's invocation of IEPA to impose tariffs. So just a quick recap. What were the issues at stake in this case? It was whether Trump was allowed to impose tariffs under IEPA, this 1977 emergency powers statute that no previous president had used to impose tariffs. The tariffs President Trump had imposed under IEPA that were broadly at issue in this case were the quote unquote universal and reciprocal tariffs, 15% on Japan, 10% on Singapore, things like that. It was also the geopolitical tariffs he's been talking about. So the fentanyl tariffs on Canada and Mexico, the so-called, although not formally at issue in the case, clearly will be decided by the outcome of this case, the things like secondary tariffs on countries that are trading with Iran, on countries that are selling oil to Cuba. Basically, all of Trump's tariffs were at issue in this case, except for the 232 tariffs. Those are the tariffs on cars, the tariffs on steel and aluminum, the kind of product-specific tariffs. And so that's what was at stake. What did the court do? Well, a six-vote member, a six-justice majority of the Supreme Court found that IEPA, this 1977 statute, simply doesn't authorize tariffs, full stop. The three conservatives who were in the majority, Justice Roberts, Justice Gorsuch, and Justice Barrett, and the three liberals who were in the majority got to that outcome in slightly different ways. The conservatives relied on something called the major questions doctrine, which is this idea that if Congress is going to provide the president with a important power for the president to do something, it has to speak clearly on the issue. The three liberal justices who don't really like the major questions doctrine in other contexts sort of got there just by looking at the text and history of IEPA. But the bottom line was the same for both of them. IEPA simply does not authorize tariffs, full stop. As we saw the president, and I won't speak in detail, we saw the president came out and sort of conceded this appears to be definitive, that he cannot impose tariffs or other kinds of fees like license fees under IEPA. And it seems to have fully removed the idea that the president can use IEPA to impose tariffs or fees. In some sense, it's a narrow ruling. It's a narrow ruling in that it does not affect the president's ability to impose tariffs under other statutes. We can talk about that in a minute, but nothing in today's ruling would constrain his ability to impose tariffs under other statutes. It also doesn't constrain other uses of IEPA. IEPA has been used by presidents going back to the 70s to impose sanctions, to impose export controls, to impose embargoes. And nothing in the ruling today constrains those uses of IEPA either. And you saw the president talk about that, how he could still impose embargoes under IEPA. It simply says this is not a tariff statute. So on one hand, it is conclusive on a bunch of Trump's tariffs, but it's also actually, in a way, a kind of narrow ruling. I will say I am personally very. It was good to see that we got a clean ruling. I was a little bit worried that you could have seen the court say, well, maybe IEEPA authorizes some tariffs, but not others. And that would have been very, very messy going forward in the courts. We did not get that. We got the kind of clean ruling. Big open question, of course, beyond what Trump will do next is refunds, obviously very much on the minds of companies. There was nothing in either the majority opinion or the concurring opinion that spoke to the matter of refunds. The only reference to refunds was a brief reference in the dissenting opinion, noting that refunds will, I think it used the word, probably be a mess. I don't have the quote in front of me, but it was definitely something in that vein. And I think as I look at this here today, the question of refunds will be litigated in the weeks and months ahead at the Court of International Trade. If I were betting on this today, I'd bet companies probably can get refunds, but there's going to be a lot of litigation to come. I will say, final point, as we look towards that issue, and also as Trump looks at other authorities, like the one true winner in 2025 of Trump's trade war was the trade lawyers. And I suspect that the trade lawyers will continue to be big winners of Trump's trade policy in 2026 as well. And this opinion and the issue of refunds, I think, is going to confirm that.
And I think that opinion, that it's going to be good for the lawyers, is certainly one that there will be no dissent, I think, on this call. Kathleen, do you want to fill in some spots, some thoughts on the ruling?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Ken, and thanks to WITA. I think obviously Peter's done a great job of surveying the landscape, and I think we should all emphasize it is early hours for our analysis of there are 170 pages here, and I would certainly say that I myself have not studied every inch, and so I think we should everything with a grain of salt what we're saying today. But here we are, hot takes in the moment, a lot to digest. But as Peter emphasized, there were a lot of different avenues the court could have taken, right? And you see several avenues across the 170 pages. But in the majority opinion, you see the Chief Justice mostly focused on that statutory interpretation question, the small sidebar on major questions doctrine, so to speak. But I think the big takeaway for me in the presentation of the Chief Justice's opinion was his emphasis on the tax power. Right? It goes all in on, right, this is a tax, because that was part of the question, right? Is this a foreign affairs power or is this a tax? And so to embrace the tax piece as strongly as the Chief Justice did here, really drove the rest of the decision, right? I think, and the terms that the court wanted to embrace. I'm not sure it's as clean as Peter suggests. There we might differ a little bit, Peter. There are a couple of things like. Firstly on, all tariffs under IEEPA versus none, versus some. That was something that I think the Federal Circuit, right, we saw really wrestle with. And so here there are some legalities and versus practicalities coming down the line, right, in terms of how the affirmation of the Federal Circuit, which includes a vacatur of the injunction below, how that's going to play out. Speaking of business for trade lawyers, if we want to get into that, happy to do that later. But I think there is some lack of cleanliness that will need to be sorted, including on the way that the court paints the three-digit tariffs and how what their contours actually mean and how circumscribed they are. So again, we could talk more about that. Last thing to maybe add to what Peter said is there's also this little pesky thing about the jurisdiction of the DDC, the District of Columbia District Court versus the CIT. And so the court cleared that up to say when you've got these tariff cases, that all needs to go to the CIT. And so that affects one of the two consolidated cases here. But without wanting to get too much in the weeds, Ken, let's go on.
First of all, our audience loves the weeds. So it's our particular wonkiness. But I should have said at the beginning, we're recording this at 3 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. The ruling's only been out for less than just 5 hours. So there's a lot of digesting still to come. I want to turn to Kate. A lot of us were tuned in to CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, wherever we get our news Wendy's already been on there once already today. What did you hear from the president? And I've already got like 4 questions have already come in the Q&A. And folks, if you have them, we'll try to weave them in as best we can about the 122 tariffs the president has already promised.
Well, none of the president's response was surprising to me, and probably not to those on the panel. I think we all anticipated that he and his team would have something ready to go, and the question was, what authority would it be? It took me right back to January when probably all of us were trying to predict which authority the president would use immediately upon inauguration. And I think a lot of us thought 122 was the way he was going to go back then. So, maybe we're getting back to where we probably should have started. And it's not lost on me that the president's ring around America is now, the reality. There are some questions about 122 and its authority, and I'm sure the lawyers on this panel will have views on, whether he can apply 10% global tariffs or whether they can only be applied to a subset of countries with which we have trade deficits. And I'd welcome their thoughts on that. I have some bigger questions that are very specific to countries, and I think we're going to have to see the language later today, and we're going to have to see how the president rolls out 301s, which I suspect will also be done to keep our trading partners in their places, right? We're going to have to deal with this other pesky issue of the trade frameworks that they've been announcing in a fast and furious way, and whether our trading partners will stay bound to those commitments without the threat of IEPA. I suspect they will, at least in the interim. And we've already seen some leaders start to hedge their bets there. But one of the big questions for me is about Canada and Mexico, because of course they were hit with IEPA tariffs, but then quickly exempted. I'm hoping someone in the administration is paying attention to the exemptions and what legal steps they need to take to ensure that the 122 tariffs don't come into place for a new set of goods that up until now have been duty-free. So I think there's probably a lot of work for the White House lawyers, not just the trade lawyers here on this call, but hopefully people are paying attention to these details. And then, of course, for those of us that spent time at USTR, I think we've all been waiting for these 301 investigations. They sure seem to be a more thoughtful way to deal with these things the president has often complained about when we're thinking about reciprocal treatment or unfair trade barriers. And I think we should give credit where it's due. The administration has secured a lot of commitments toward addressing these unfair trade barriers that probably a lot of folks on this call have complained about. How are we gonna address that in a bunch of 301s? How is USTR going to staff this sort of thing? And then frankly, are we gonna end up with, as the president threatened in this press conference, ultimately higher tariff rates? Certainly they will be more durable. So hopefully we get them right.
You ask them all the right questions, Kate. It's all the ones that everybody's asking. And we do have questions coming in. You answered a couple of them already. The questions about starting to answer the questions about 122. Wendy, turning to you as a former senior negotiator, following all these so carefully. Big China meetings coming up, planned in a few weeks at this point. What do you think this is going to mean for the ongoing negotiation? We have the negotiations that concluded, and the impact it's going to have on those, and then the ones that we haven't even been wrapped up yet.
So my view is, with respect to the agreements in place, that they will continue to remain in place with our partners. And why do I say that? Because all of them knew that this decision was coming down the pike, and I have no doubt that the administration during the negotiations made it very clear that they have a plan B, that tariffs will remain in place. So therefore, please work with us. I think if a country now were to walk away from this deal or raise major questions on whether they were going to comply, I think they would raise the ire of the White House. And I think, as we've all seen, Trump will find a way to kind of give it back to them, and not in a good way. So my view is that these deals will stay in place. In terms of, in most countries now that Indonesia and Taiwan and a few others these deals fell into place last week. I mean, the major countries with no deals include Vietnam, Philippines, and Thailand, but even those countries have some kind of framework deals announced already.
India.
China, what?
Joe, do you want to jump in?
Oh, and let me just
I was
mention
just going to add
China.
India.
Well,
I was
India,
gonna
but I would say we have we announced a deal last week. China, though, China's interesting because remember, we only had 20 percentage point tariffs in place for them now, plus the Trump won Section 301 tariffs. So we recalibrated our tariff reduction and they met that when we went up to 145%. So it will be interesting to see whether China adjusts its tariffs at all, or as a result of this upcoming meeting in April, we do find a mechanism with China, at least to adjust some tariffs, particularly in non-strategic areas. What I'm going to be looking for going forward, and a question for our lawyers, is like Section 122 allows the president to go up to 15% for 150 days. Why did he choose only to go to 10%? Is that just because it's a safer route, or is there something else going on that that we should be thinking about? And also the scope and the scope and duration of the Section 301 investigations announced. My sense is they'll probably be broader than most people than traditionally they have been, but also they'll pop out. The decisions will pop out a lot quicker, and we may see just rolling public hearings on different Section 301 investigations in order to keep the process moving.
Let me just follow up one quick question on the China front, though, Wendy, and it goes to one of the questions. I mean, what do you think this does for the president walking into those meetings with President Xi in April, assuming that still happens? That he doesn't have quite the hammer that he had a few hours ago.
I think come April, it's going to be pretty clear that he still has that, substantial authority, and he can still hit these countries, and that these deals, which, many of them have, one could say, anti-China provisions, are still remain in place. So I'm not as worried about him going into a meeting with Xi Jinping with a weaker hand because of IEPA. At least that's my initial reaction.
And Chris, following up with you, how do you think the other countries that we're talking to are going to react? We have a lot of existing agreements on reciprocal trade. I always have to slow down when I start saying that acronym, the ARTS. How are they going to react? We have these agreements, India, for example, Joe, you might want to opine on this too, agreed to an 18% tariff, and he's just doing these 122s that are 10%. Well, what does that mean for the 18% they agreed to a few days ago?
I agree with Wendy. I think most of the countries that have got deals will want to keep them, not least because important to many of those deals were not just the reciprocal tariff rate that they negotiated, but even more important, the exemptions or the caps on the sectoral tariffs, autos, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, and others. And other trading partners know that if they reopen the deals, they may lose those caps because the president can go a lot higher on 232 if he wants to. And that's on a pretty firm legal footing. The question in my mind will be, I don't think the trading partners will want to reopen the agreements. Will the president want to reopen the agreements? And he hinted that today in his press conference that he might. Given that some of those deals were negotiated on the basis of IEPA tariffs, they're now no longer in effect, or we have a 10% instead of an 18% rate, he may say, well, we've got to renegotiate. And I think that is certainly a possibility. It'll be interesting to watch which countries and how they react. I think the Europeans may not be able to help themselves from trying to use this as an opportunity to say, oh, well, all bets are off. The European Parliament hasn't acted yet. I think that would be self-defeating. And I think the Commission will oppose it, but it wouldn't surprise me if that happened.
Chris,
The
they
bottom
already
line,
did.
I was about to literally,
the
Kate, I was
chair
about
of
to
the
come to you.
oh,
Intercommittee
did they?
already said
Well,
that.
there you go. It's some things are, it's like the sun coming up tomorrow. You can predict. But I think the interesting thing about this will be, clearly the president has the ability to reimpose a lot of the tariffs, but there are some that he either won't be able to reimpose legally, or that he may choose not to reimpose. And to me, that's the thing to watch. So the political tariffs, threats against the EU over Greenland, threats against Brazil, or the tariffs against Brazil over the Bolsonaro imprisonment, those clearly go against what the Supreme Court said today. And yet those are some of the president's favorite tariffs. So if he tries to reimpose some of those using Section 338 or some other mechanism, I think there's a chance those could be challenged and pretty quickly struck down, and that will grate against the president, I suspect. The other question, though, is there a middle tier of countries who maybe don't rise to the level of justifying a 301 case that he just doesn't reimpose the tariffs after these 10% levies expire in 150 days? Think Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, most countries in Africa, smaller countries in Latin America, Turkey, Egypt. All those tariffs on all those countries are purely IEPA, and in 150 days, theoretically, they go back to MFN WTO rates. Will we do 301s against some of these countries? I don't know. In a way, the Supreme Court has offered the president a golden political opportunity in a midterm election year to reset his tariff policy, to focus it on countries that matter, and get rid of a lot of these silly tariffs by simply quietly not reimposing them. Will he seize that, or will he be unable to help himself? That's what I'll be watching.
I'm not going to comment on that, but I do want to see if Peter or Kathleen have any thoughts on what we've talked about so far with any of the authorities that the president might use going forward as our two resident trade lawyers on the call. If not seeing you bump in, Joe.
Well, I'm happy to. I was
Peter,
waiting.
yeah.
I was giving Kathleen a moment, but I'll make just a couple of comments. I mean, I don't know, obviously, why the president chose 10% under 122 verse 15 when the 122 clearly authorizes up to 15. My sort of working hypothesis is, at least in my read of 122, and 122 has never been used before today, and so has never been litigated, so we don't really know what it means. But my, working hypothesis on my read of 122 is I think there's actually some ambiguity about whether the president can do sort of differential rates, 15% on some countries and 10% on others. And so they might, to have avoided legal uncertainty, having just lost this IEPA case, decided, A, easier to keep it across the board at 10% rather than trying to do differential tariff rates. And then B, to pick up on Chris's theme, maybe, Trump loves tariffs. I don't think he's going to do a major recalibration of his tariff policy because he just, he's tariff man, right? He has been very clear he's tariff man. But maybe it did kind of come down. Maybe he does want to bring the rate down just a little bit rather than trying to maximally reimpose them.
Kathleen?
Just to chime in, so I think there are a couple of reasons we could see the 10%. One is if 10% is a sort of is in fact a baseline that we want to see, right? We see it across the best deals, right? End up kind of in that range, so then it makes sense, and everything else would go on top of that. But not worth really crystal ball or hypothesizing on that. I think the bigger question is, as others have alluded to, and we've seen a lot of questions in the Q&A about it, sort of what happens with the exemptions, right, that were built into the prior regime, and will they come back or will they not? And so, as Kate said, right, so much depends on the rollout of how this is structured when we see this in the coming days, how it gets implemented, and then precisely all of those features about how it gets rolled out and all the exemptions coming in or not coming in will lead to litigation, as also has been suggested. So, Ken, to your theme of lots of work for lawyers, there was one other question, Ken, on that, particularly about the length of time on 122. Right, we said it was 150 days, but in our last webinar, I think WITA webinar, somebody said, well, couldn't he just, unless Congress extends, but couldn't he just on day 151 issue a new 122? And I think it's hard to see what would stop him from trying to do that, and perhaps actually that being seen as permissible by the court. So is the 150-day limit an actual limit? We'll see. We'll see if they want to go longer, and if so, how they do it.
That's a really great question. And again, as Peter said, if we haven't used 122, there's not case history to look back on and say, well, he can't do that. There's not precedent. Wendy, it looks like you unmuted. Did you have something to jump in on? No, Joe.
One thing I wanted to draw some attention to is maybe picking up on what Chris said about actions against other countries in Section 301 cases. I've followed 301 pretty closely for a long time. Generally, 301 cases, I mean, there's going to need to be some real creativity and probably a real expansion of the use of 301 authority if they go beyond a small group of countries, right? Because, and I paid very close attention to what Greer said at the press briefing today, and maybe I'm parsing too closely, but he specifically referred to unfair trade practices, which is what Section 301 is supposed to address. That seems to imply that it's going to be tough to apply that to 120 countries or something like that. That maybe you pick a handful, 10, 12 of the countries with the highest trade deficits or with your highest priorities, and you issue 301s against them. In addition, of course, there's all this process that has to go along with it. So this raises a legal question too. I know 301 is quite broad, but it does say unfair trade practices, and it also does say violations of trade agreements, some of which, as Wendy mentioned, not all of these countries have or don't have an agreement in writing. That's why I mentioned India, because they're still working on the text. And is India going to have an incentive to complete the text to give them more rope to hang themselves with? I don't know. Maybe they will. But, and the scope of these 301 cases have generally been practice driven too. I mean, you cite an unfair trade practice specifically. So could, for example, the administration consider a trade deficit an unfair trade practice just on its face? Is that something that they could do? Maybe. That could be litigated too. I'm interested in what the lawyers have to say about that, because the law doesn't really speak to a definition of an unfair trade practice. And how much traffic can the 301 procedure bear, unless they're going to launch like a massive, actually there was such a thing called Super 301. Some of us here remember this back in 1989. And I worked on it, but are they going to do something like that again? So I'm really interested to see how they handle that. And the other thing I'm interested in, another question, is, as Wendy said, there's several countries, including Vietnam, including the Philippines and Thailand, who have not completed agreements. So do their incentives change now? Especially because, as I said, 301 mentions violations of a trade agreement. So are you giving the administration more ammunition if you conclude your trade agreement? But on the other hand, if you start dragging your feet, you're going to attract the ire of the administration. The final thing I'll just say is just a little bit about 301. The investigation can take, a few months, can be faster or shorter, but there is a process. But once you've completed the investigation and imposed a tariff, then you can start the EO machine up again. You can amend your action under Section 301 by a new EO a week later if you're unhappy with something that the country has done. So there will be a temporary period of maybe 150, a few months. It'll need to align probably with this 150-day period somewhat. And then, but once you get the 301 tariffs in place, whatever they may be, then the president has a lot of discretion on how he plays that. The final thing I would just note that hasn't been noted yet is we do have an election later this year, and these tariffs are going to be applied later this year. So we'll see if that has any impact.
And certainly, I think Chris referenced that as well. Kathleen?
Yes. Right.
So Joe, I'm not. That was a very rosy picture, perhaps, of 301 and how it's going to work. I appreciate that, but this is why it was interesting. I think the Chief Justice's opinion, how much time was spent on talking about these 3-digit statutes as being circumscribed and heavily contained, when in fact they're really not. I mean, it's all relative, right? So if you look, right, there's a lot of space, as Joe says, for 301. We can have multiple of them in one time. There's an expedited track where you can do the hearing after, right? So there's all sorts of ways that we move very quickly, and I think can easily cover deficits as a concern, or at least try to, right, as a concern. And the courts have been fairly deferential, not just on 301, but also on 232. And so where the Supreme Court said today, there's a discussion about 232 having both more discretion and being more circumscribed than IEPA. I think really what we're just doing is pushing things more into an economic security discussion litigation discussion, where we'll now start to see the agencies having to defend these choices, right, more than this discussion about what IEPA contains or not, right? So that's where I think we're going. And maybe one just last thing to say here too, we didn't mention before in the discussion of 122, that is how CIT, the Court of International Trade, in this case that we are discussing today, the opinion of last spring, blessed 122 as the appropriate vehicle for the president to take here, right? So I think we have the court decisions that have come before this moment in the lower courts do not necessarily give us great faith, if that's what people are looking for, that there will be more containment in what the administration will do going forward.
And do we think just that they can stack the 301s on top of the 122s?
There's been a lot of stacking so far.
Yeah.
Others on the call will probably have more experience with that. The one thing that we don't really know, right, is what the way, again, how he writes the 122 order, how that is, that on top of MFN, is that on top of the deals?
Somebody asked about that.
Yeah, so I think we don't know yet, right? And to see how that's written out will be clear. What he said in the press conference was not clear.
Can I just add that in place now, we have a very broad 301, ongoing 301 on China's adherence to the phase 1 agreement. So that could be the vehicle to deal with China if indeed we wanted to keep tariffs in. And I believe also with respect to Brazil, we have a pretty broad 301 investigation underway. And Kathleen just reminded me that we have done 301s in the past, picking one practice, and I think it's been digital, where we've named like 8 or 10, 12 countries at once.
Taxes. Yep.
Yeah. So you're reminding me of all the time that Joe and I and others spent on these 301 investigations and being part of them. A lot of creativity and a lot of different approaches were taken. Some are very specific, Korea corn or, Japan autos or something. Others were just much broader. And so I just think we're going to see broader 301s. The other point I want to make, I thought it was interesting as well that Section 232 wasn't referred to in this context unless I missed it. They're talking about 122 and 301 investigations. I did not hear additional 232 investigations. Also, I would note that I thought it was interesting, the president deferred to Ambassador Greer during the presser, not to Lutnick, which also suggested to me that it's the 301 process, but also that Greer and USTR may be, their value may be, on the recognition of all the hard work they do and how they can make this all work and fit together is increasingly being appreciated by the president.
And I'll remind, and I'm going to go to Kate next, with the National Trade Estimates report, they list out a whole, 50, 60 countries is one of our Joe Whitlock mentions, and one of the questions. They could just base their 301 findings on what the work they've already done in a lot of cases. Kate, come back to you.
Well, I'm reminded actually by Wendy's comment that there are also several rumored 301 investigations that we've not yet seen, of course, including investigations into pharmaceutical freeloading, which, as we understand it, is addressed at several countries, just like the digital services tax 301. So maybe we'll see some of those going forward. But I'm also struck by this discussion around, I think what Joe said around a 301 looking at the trade agreements. And I think there has been quite a lot of criticism about the trade frameworks because there is no enforcement. There's no way to ensure that anyone's going to do what they say they're going to do. And I think actually the 301 might be a very interesting way to get at that. And I would also say the 301 is probably now also the way to get at a better tariff treatment for your country. 301s throughout history. I mean, some that I worked on, were with respect to Europe and treatment of hormone beef, right? We didn't end up at the very end with tariffs. We ended up with an agreement that preferenced certain types of exports and treatment for US beef. So I think the 301 now supplants these other tariff negotiations as the pathway to a negotiated outcome. And then on the flip side, something that we can check and over time review the same way we are with China. So I think this is just another way of replacing the congressional role here. And I'm wondering what Congress will have to say about it.
That's interesting. So Yeah, well, right, we'll get to that. So basically what you're saying is the 301 becomes the enforcement mechanism for the agreements that they're reaching, which I think
Yeah.
would have been the case perhaps even before the IEPA ruling. Chris, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's important to, Joe talked about Super 301. What we may be about to head to is Super Duper 301. Because remember that once you've got the 301 finding, it's like you've got the hall pass. You can go to the bathroom as many times as you want. Remember that President Biden used the President Trump's 301 finding on China to impose tariffs on electric vehicles, for example. So, there is, as Wendy mentioned, there's another 301 investigation against China, but frankly, they don't need it. They could use the finding from back in the first Trump administration. So I do think we're going to see multiple country 301s. Kate mentioned the one potentially on pharmaceutical, so-called freeloading. That could be one. We could see them in other sectors as well. But the key point is that these will be focused on trade issues. They'll be focused on discrimination or market access, which I think all of us on this call would agree is a good thing and maybe a proper use of the trade laws and what Congress intended. What's going to drive the president crazy, though, is that he can't, that's not lately his primary use of tariffs. He wants to wake up at 3 in the morning and get on Truth Social and threaten the country with tariffs because they did something he didn't like, regardless of whether it has anything to do with trade. And what I'll be watching, and it was interesting, the president in his press conference specifically mentioned Section 338. I'll be interested to see, does the president go to his cabinet and say, darn it, I want to be able to impose a tariff against this country tomorrow morning because I don't like the color of this leader's eyes. And they'll say, well, there's Section 338, Mr. President, try that. The difference between 338 and the others is that there are no notice and comment requirements. It's from a 1930 law that's never been, used, but it gives the president very wide discretion. And so will we see an attempt to reimpose some of these political tariffs through that mechanism? And if so, frankly, will other countries take it all that seriously? I'm not sure. I think the president's credibility on some of these tariff threats was already a deteriorating asset, particularly after the Greenland episode. And that may be even more the case now because the Supreme Court clearly said you cannot use these tariffs in a way that Congress did not intend. And I don't think they intended them to be used for foreign policy reasons.
That's an interesting question. Joe, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think I wanted to mention a couple of other things that Chris and others reminded me of, just because they have been mentioned, but something that I was asked, I don't know if it's in the questions. A number of these trade agreements, or actually all of the RTAs that have been, ARTs, excuse me, that have been completed, the country acknowledges the US reciprocal tariff of a certain rate, 18 or 19%. And I'm being asked, so can the administration use that then as part of this sort of rationale of a violation of a trade agreement to say, you agreed that we could apply an 18% tariff. So under a 301 investigation, or however mechanism, we're going back to 18% and don't complain about it because you already agreed to it. Peter, is that?
Well, you see, I've been wondering about this, and I know we're kind of coming to time, but I'd love others' views on this because I wonder if it actually will cut the other way in the following sense. Like, in order to have your 301 tariffs, you have to find an unfair trade practice that burdens U.S. commerce. And the message out of the White House with all these trade agreements is, well, Japan no longer engages in unfair trade practices because they've, signed this trade agreement where they're giving us better market access and blah, 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 blah. Like, I actually don't know how it's going to play out from a sort of legal perspective, because if Japan and the UK have solved all the unfair trade practices in light of the trade deals, like what's the legal basis for the 301 saying this is all unfair? I could see it going either way is my point.
Good point.
What other
some
thing
trade agreements on the head of a pin, I think it sounds like. Chris, did you want to, we're going to go around and just get some final words. Okay. Chris?
I think Peter made a good point, but I'm not sure the facts will matter. I think they will do 301s against the big trading partners like Japan and Europe and Korea because they will need it as a basis to keep some tariffs and these agreements in place.
Wendy? You're muted.
I'd just be interested to see if our trading partners now get together and try to figure out, if not a united response, but try and coordinate a response to all of this. Right now, most countries, when being asked, have basically said, we're going to be studying this. We need to, we have more work to do here. We want blah, 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 blah. We want to see what actions the president will take. But I wonder if this might lead to more coordination among our trading partners in developing more of a kind of collective response.
Let me just ask a quick question, and I know we're running to time, but following up on this 301 thing, we were talking about the Trump won China tariffs were in place. Biden wanted to stop the Chinese EVs from coming in, use the 301 mechanism. There were no threats of Chinese EVs in the United States. They weren't undermining U.S. automakers because there aren't any. There literally were none in the country, or unless they've been imported through some strange mechanism. So basically, by putting in a 301 on a bunch of different countries, it sort of does it open a door for them to just whenever they feel like it to say we're going to add it, we're adding now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what the president meant today when he said he could maybe go higher.
Right.
You could argue that his power is fairly unlimited under 301, although it was pretty unlimited under IEPA as he interpreted it.
We did. Any last words, Kathleen and Kate?
Maybe just, I mean, I myself consider the State of the Union pretty must-see TV, not least of all because it will be super uncomfortable with the justices. But we haven't talked about refunds, and he hasn't really. I mean, I'm not sure he's given up on his idea to write checks to the American people and somehow deplete the refund pool before businesses have a chance to get at it. So maybe not, but I think he has an opportunity to really speak to the American public on Tuesday, and he'll have something to say.
I certainly expect so. Kathleen?
So there are 56 questions in the Q&A, and I think we've maybe answered 2 of them, but let me try and answer the other 56, the other 54 in 30 seconds. We don't know. We don't know how the 122 will be implemented, stacking exemptions, longevity, legality. We don't know how the current tariffs, the ones that were in existence as of 9:59 this morning, and frankly, could still be collected right now, how those will be unwound. There's going to be more litigation at the CIT. We don't know how the U.S. or other countries are going to treat this decision with respect to the deals. We don't know what the 301s are going to look like. We don't know what the refund process is going to look like. Lots of options on the table. And we don't know how Congress is going to react. So a great webinar, Ken, a simple universe to a much more complicated one. Thanks so much.
Can I mention one thing that we do know, Ken, probably?
Yeah, please.
We're as ignorant as everybody else. I agree with Kathleen. But I think there's one thing we do know. 2 words. Import surge. The tariffs are going to be 10% for a period of time, and then they're probably going to go up after that. So the trade deficit for 2026, I predict, probably won't be much better than it was for 2025. And the administration might not be happy about that.
But just a side note, WITA's trade conference is starting Monday and Tuesday. We hope that you guys can join us. I am sure that this will be a big topic of conversation at our International Trade Conference. And a couple of you are already going to be joining us there, and we're grateful to you for being there. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your making the time on such short notice to be with us today. There's a lot to talk about, a lot to learn. I'm sure we'll be following up on this for months to come. We mentioned it's going to be great business for lawyers. It's going to be a lot of work for WITA too, so we'll be there for you guys. Thank you, everybody.